She woke up before the sun. The city was still quiet and the streets were mostly empty. She liked this time of the morning when everything felt calm, and she could gather her thoughts before the world demanded her attention. Her small apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old books, a comforting mix that reminded her of home, even if home had always been more of a feeling than a place. Every morning, she dressed in simple clothes, nothing flashy, nothing to attract attention. She believed that her actions, not her appearance, should speak for her. Walking through her neighborhood, she greeted the shopkeepers who knew her by face but rarely by name. They smiled politely and she returned the smile, but she kept moving. Her life had always been like that, a balance between blending in and quietly observing. At work, she was known for being quiet and diligent. She didn't raise her voice in meetings or try to claim credit loudly. Her strength was in her consistency, in the quality of her work and the care she gave to everything she touched. Some people mistook her silence for weakness, and she had long learned that the world often underestimated people who didn't shout to be heard. Her boss was one of those people. He was a man with influence and a sharp tongue, someone who believed that power came from intimidation. He had started paying attention to her recently, not because of her talents, but because she refused to play the games he expected. Where others flattered him or feared him, she simply did her job well and stayed out of unnecessary conflicts. That calm independence annoyed him more than he would admit. One afternoon, as she returned from lunch, she found a note on her desk. It was anonymous, simple, and chilling in its tone, a reminder that she should not challenge the authority around her. She folded it carefully and placed it in her drawer. Her heart beat a little faster, but she didn't panic. She had faced difficult people before, and she understood that fear was something the other person wanted her to feel. Despite the pressure, she continued her work. Her colleagues noticed a change in her demeanor, but it was subtle. She wasn't acting differently. She was simply more alert, more precise, more protective of herself. She paid closer attention to her surroundings, who said what, and who watched when she entered a room. The office became a stage where she quietly observed the players, waiting for the right moment to respond if needed. Outside of work, her life was simple but rich in its own way. She volunteered at the local community center a few evenings a week. There, she helped children with homework, organized small events, and listened to the problems of families who had nowhere else to turn. She was gentle with them, patient and kind, but she also encouraged independence, teaching them that they could stand tall even when the world seemed to push them down. Her neighbors often noticed her kindness, though few knew much about her personal life. She didn't talk about herself much, preferring to focus on others. Her silence was not empty. It was full of thought, observation, and understanding, and yet even in her quiet life, the world had a way of finding its way to her. It started with small things, whispers in the office, sideways glances, and subtle attempts to discredit her. Then came more direct actions. Projects she had worked on were suddenly reassigned. Credit she had earned was given to someone else, and her suggestions in meetings were dismissed without consideration. Her boss seemed to enjoy the discomfort he caused, believing he could manipulate her through quiet intimidation. But she remained calm. She had learned early on that reaction often gave the other person power. By staying steady, she maintained control over herself. One evening, after another long day, she walked home under the fading light of dusk. The city was no longer calm but noisy and bustling, with the sounds of traffic and distant sirens. She paused on the bridge overlooking the river, watching the water move steadily, calmly, without rushing or resisting. It reminded her that strength often came from patience and persistence, not force. The river had its own path, and nothing could stop it from reaching the sea. She drew comfort from that thought. Back at home, she made a simple dinner, the kind she had perfected over years. Cooking was one of the few things that brought her pure satisfaction. It required attention, patience, and care, qualities she valued deeply. While she ate, she reviewed the events of the day, noting patterns and behaviors. She didn't dwell on anger or fear. Instead, she focused on understanding. The world had its challenges, but she had faced worse, and she knew she could navigate this too. Her silence in the office was often misread. Some thought she was timid. Others assumed she would give up if pushed hard enough. What they didn't understand was that she was observing, calculating, and preparing. Her mind worked in quiet, deliberate ways. She was building a foundation strong enough to withstand any storm, And while her boss and his allies tried to shake her, they were unaware that their actions were revealing their own weaknesses, not hers. She also began keeping a small journal, not to vent her feelings but to record facts, incidents, and thoughts. It was her way of seeing the bigger picture. She noted patterns of behavior, inconsistencies in the stories of those who tried to undermine her, and moments of subtle support from unexpected places. She began to see the outlines of a strategy forming, one that relied not on anger but on truth, persistence, and the quiet accumulation of evidence. As the weeks passed, the pressure at work increased. Her boss grew bolder, believing that silence equaled submission. But each act against her only strengthened her resolve. She learned to navigate the office politics with careful steps, maintaining professionalism and dignity while quietly asserting her competence. She reached out to colleagues who had previously seemed indifferent, building alliances based on mutual respect rather than fear or flattery. She realized that strength was not only in standing alone, but in connecting with others who understood the value of integrity. Her personal life remained a sanctuary. Even as the storm of work threatened to engulf her, she found moments of peace in the small routines that mattered. A quiet morning coffee, a walk through the park, a call with a distant relative, or simply reading a book before bed. These moments reminded her that her life was not defined by the attempts of others to diminish her, but by her own choices, resilience, and care for herself and those around her. By the end of the first part of her journey, she had learned an important truth, that being underestimated was not a weakness but a weapon. Those who tried to crush her had revealed themselves through their own fear, arrogance, and aggression. And in her quiet observation, she had discovered her own power, not the loud power the world often admired, but the steady, unyielding kind that could endure and ultimately triumph. The first part of her story closed not with a confrontation, but with preparation. She knew the world would continue to test her, and she would face new challenges, but she also knew that she would meet them with the same quiet strength, careful observation, and unwavering determination that had carried her through every difficulty before. The storm had not yet come, but she was ready to face it when it did, and when the time was right, she would respond in a way that no one could ignore. The days that followed were heavy with tension. At work, the quiet woman noticed that her boss's behavior was growing sharper, more aggressive. He was trying to push her into mistakes, questioning decisions she had made and criticizing her work in front of colleagues. She felt the weight of it, but she refused to react with anger. Anger, she knew, would only give him power and play into his hands. She stayed calm, noting each detail, observing the patterns of his attacks. Her colleagues started to take notice of the tension. Some avoided her, unsure of how to act, while others whispered behind closed doors, unsure if they should take sides. She did not seek sympathy. Instead, she focused on her work, doing it with the precision and care she always did. Yet the effort it took to maintain composure was exhausting. Every day required vigilance, patience, and a careful assessment of what could be said, done, or ignored. One afternoon, an important project she had been leading was suddenly reassigned to someone else. She had spent weeks preparing it, researching details and coordinating with different departments. When she confronted her boss, he shrugged and said it was better suited for someone else. He smiled in a way that made it clear he expected her to be upset, but she kept her face neutral. Inside, she felt a mix of frustration and determination. This was the moment she realized that staying quiet was not enough. She would need to act, but she would act with thought and strategy. Outside of work, she found solace in her routines. She returned to the community center more often, spending longer hours helping children with their homework and organizing small workshops. The smiles of the children, the trust in their eyes, and the gratitude of their parents reminded her that her life had value beyond office politics. These moments kept her grounded, reminding her that the world was not entirely cruel, and that she had the power to make a positive difference even in small ways. Her evenings were filled with reflection. She kept a small journal, writing down every incident at work, every word, and every action that felt threatening or manipulative. She wrote not as a victim but as an observer, documenting facts and patterns. This practice gave her clarity and a sense of control. She could see the bigger picture forming, a web of behavior that revealed not only the cruelty of her boss, but also his weaknesses and insecurities. Despite the challenges, She also noticed moments of subtle support. A colleague who usually kept to himself offered a piece of advice in passing. Another quietly praised her work in a meeting without drawing attention. These small gestures reminded her that even in a hostile environment, allies could be found, and not everyone was blind to her worth. As the tension at work increased, so did her resolve. She began to anticipate her boss's moves, preparing her work carefully, documenting her decisions and ensuring that nothing could be twisted against her. She started to speak more strategically in meetings, asking precise questions that exposed inconsistencies without being confrontational. Her silence was no longer passive. It was intentional, a tool to navigate a dangerous environment while maintaining her dignity. One day, she received an email from a higher-level manager asking to meet and discuss her recent work. Her heart skipped a beat, unsure if it was an opportunity or a trap. She prepared meticulously, gathering facts, examples, and evidence of her contributions. The meeting was tense, but she presented herself with calm confidence. She answered questions clearly, provided documentation, and avoided emotional reactions. The manager left the meeting with a nod, and though nothing immediate changed, she knew she had planted a seed of recognition for her integrity and competence. Meanwhile, the antagonist, believing he still held the upper hand, escalated his tactics. He began spreading rumors, subtle insinuations designed to make others question her abilities and credibility. She heard about them from colleagues, some of whom were unsure if they should share the information. Each rumor was carefully noted in her journal. She understood that the truth would eventually shine through, and that the actions of someone desperate to control others often revealed their own fragility. The stress was not without effect. There were nights when she lay awake, thinking of how unfair the world could be, of how easily someone could try to destroy another's life out of ego or fear. She felt moments of doubt and sadness, but they were fleeting. She reminded herself of her purpose, of the work she loved, and the lives she touched outside of the office. These thoughts strengthened her. She knew that real power did not lie in loud words or threats, but in quiet resilience and consistent action. At home, she started to take more care of herself, both mentally and physically. She cooked meals with more attention, walked longer distances, and read books that inspired courage and strategy. She began meditating even for a few minutes each day, focusing on her breath and clearing her mind. These small practices were her shield against the growing storm, keeping her grounded, centered, and ready for what was coming. One evening, as she returned from the community center, she noticed that a few neighbors had left small notes of encouragement on her door. Simple messages like "You are appreciated" and "Keep going" made her smile quietly to herself. She realized that even though the world could be cruel, small acts of kindness and recognition still existed. These gestures reminded her that her presence mattered, and that her courage, even when unseen, was noticed by those who truly understood. Her strategy began to take shape. She would continue to perform her duties with excellence, gather allies, and quietly expose the inconsistencies and manipulations of her boss. She was no longer just defending herself. She was preparing to reclaim her space with dignity and truth. Her silence was no longer a shield alone. It had become a weapon, a careful, precise tool to navigate and eventually dismantle the attempts to crush her. One particularly challenging day, her boss tried to humiliate her in front of the whole team, questioning her competence on a project she had led from the beginning. She responded calmly, citing facts, providing clear explanations, and remaining composed. Some colleagues watched in surprise, realizing that the quiet woman was not fragile but formidable. That day marked a turning point. She had not sought revenge, but she had asserted her presence and capability in a way that could not be ignored. As weeks passed, the pattern became clear. The more the antagonist tried to control and intimidate, the more she adapted and grew stronger. She began to notice cracks in his behavior, impatience, frustration, and the occasional misstep that revealed his insecurity. She documented everything, preparing for the day when truth and perseverance would have their moment. At home, she continued her personal rituals. Cooking, walking, reading, and journaling became acts of resistance and self-preservation. She reached out occasionally to friends and family for support, not because she needed saving, but because shared strength reinforced her own. She realized that her life was full of people who believed in her quietly, and that their faith was a source of resilience she could draw upon. One morning, she received another note, this one more aggressive. directly warning her to stop challenging authority. She did not flinch. Instead, she placed it in her journal, a reminder of the stakes but not a threat she would surrender to. She understood that fear was a tool used by those who lacked real power. Her strength lay in knowing her worth, her abilities, and the truth of her actions. By the end of this part of her journey, she had learned much about human nature. She had seen the cruelty of those who try to dominate others, but also the quiet support of those who recognize integrity. She understood that patience, careful observation, and strategic action were more powerful than anger or rash decisions. She had weathered attacks, protected her dignity, and found new sources of strength within herself and in her community. The second part of her story closed with her preparing for the next steps. She knew the world would continue to challenge her, and the antagonist would try new tactics. But she was no longer merely surviving. She was learning, growing, and planning. Her silence was now active, a conscious choice that carried power. The storm had begun to form around her, and while it would test her, she was ready to face it with patience, intelligence, and the quiet courage that had always defined her. She had survived the first attempts to crush her, and now she was preparing to rise. As the weeks passed, she began to see the outlines of a strategy forming in her mind. The attacks at work were becoming bolder, but she was no longer reacting passively. She started planning carefully how to protect herself while exposing the truth. Her journal had grown thick with notes, observations, and evidence of the subtle and not-so-subtle ways her boss tried to undermine her. Each page was a record of resilience, a map of the battlefield she now understood she could navigate. She began reaching out to colleagues quietly, those who had been neutral or unsure, offering support and listening to their concerns. She did not ask for loyalty or allegiance. She simply listened, acknowledged their feelings, and shared insights. Slowly, she started to form a network of quiet allies who respected her integrity and saw the injustice she faced. These small connections were invaluable. They offered perspective, subtle support, and sometimes even small bits of information that others shared in trust. One morning, she noticed an opportunity. A project critical to the company's success was being mishandled, and her expertise could make a difference. Instead of waiting for permission or recognition, she took the initiative. She prepared a detailed plan, outlining the steps needed to correct the project and improve results. She presented it carefully, not as a challenge to her boss, but as a contribution to the company's success. Her calm confidence and thorough preparation caught the attention of other managers who had previously overlooked her. Her boss noticed too. He was frustrated that she had taken the initiative without his approval, but instead of retaliating directly, he tried to undermine her subtly, questioning minor details and trying to cast doubt on her decisions. She was ready for this. She responded with facts, documentation, and clarity, never raising her voice or showing emotion. Her patience and preparation were her armor, and she began to realize that the more he tried to control her, the more visible her competence became. Outside of work, she continued her community involvement. The children and families at the center had begun to notice a change in her confidence. She shared stories of perseverance, patience, and quiet courage, not as lessons but as reflections from her own life. They listened intently, inspired by someone who acted with integrity even when the world was unfair. She began to see that her influence extended beyond herself, shaping others who would carry strength forward. Her evenings were spent in reflection and planning. She reviewed every interaction, every note, every piece of evidence, thinking strategically about how to respond if her boss escalated further. She understood the power of patience. Immediate retaliation could be dangerous. Careful planning and deliberate action were more effective. She also took time for self-care, walking in the park, cooking, reading, and meditating. These routines were not luxuries but tools that kept her grounded and focused. One day she received news that a major error had occurred in a department she had previously helped. The mistake could cost the company time and money. Many employees panicked, but she remained calm. She saw an opportunity not to attack or gain credit, but to provide solutions. She worked quietly behind the scenes, coordinating with colleagues and offering guidance. The project recovered and the solution bore her mark, though she did not seek acknowledgement. Yet others noticed. Her competence and calm problem-solving could not be hidden. Her boss, seeing her influence grow, became more aggressive. He began trying to manipulate other colleagues against her, spreading rumors and casting doubt on her integrity. She continued to document everything, noting dates, times, and witnesses. Each action, each rumor, each attempt to undermine her became part of a larger picture she was building. She knew that exposing the truth required patience and proof, not impulsive confrontation. She also began to use her silence as a strategic tool. Instead of defending herself constantly, she allowed actions and evidence to speak for her. When false accusations were made, she responded calmly, factually, and without emotional display. Her quiet strength became more noticeable. People who had doubted her began to respect her, while those who sought to diminish her influence were increasingly exposed by their own behavior. Her community work provided additional strength. She realized that helping others gave her purpose beyond the office. The children she worked with were learning resilience, patience, and self-respect from her example. Their progress and trust reinforced her own courage. She began to see her life as a web of influence, where her actions could impact more than just her immediate surroundings. Her presence, quiet yet deliberate, created ripples that extended outward. One afternoon, she received an anonymous email praising her recent efforts in the project recovery. It was brief, simple, and encouraging. She smiled to herself, knowing that someone had noticed her integrity and competence, even if they preferred to remain unseen. This small acknowledgement reminded her that quiet victories could be as powerful as loud ones. Her work and actions were making a difference, and the truth of her value was slowly being recognized. Her strategy began to include careful documentation of her achievements and the obstacles placed in her path. She maintained spreadsheets, notes, and records of her contributions, meetings, and interactions. She also kept a record of her boss's actions, inconsistencies, and attempts to undermine her. This meticulous preparation was not born from paranoia, but from a clear understanding that the world often rewarded those who could prove their worth and expose injustice with evidence. As time went on, she started to speak more assertively in meetings, not in anger or defensiveness, but with calm authority. She asked precise questions that highlighted issues, suggested solutions, and ensured that her voice was heard without confrontation. Colleagues began to take her more seriously. Some who had previously doubted her competence now saw her as a quiet leader. Her boss, frustrated by her growing influence, tried more aggressive tactics, but they only revealed his desperation and weaknesses. At home, she continued to nurture herself and her relationships. She spent time with close friends, sharing thoughts and laughter. She cooked meals with care, savoring the process and the results. She walked in nature, enjoying the quiet and observing the world around her. These activities replenished her energy and reminded her that her life was not defined by the conflict at work. She had a world beyond the office, and it was filled with beauty, kindness, and purpose. One evening, a colleague approached her with a concern about a project mishandled by her boss. Instead of reacting defensively, she listened carefully, gathered information, and offered solutions. Her calm, competent handling of the situation impressed not only the colleague, but also other team members who observed her approach. Slowly, the perception of her as quiet and passive shifted. She was becoming recognized for her intelligence, patience, and strength. Her boss, realizing that his influence was waning, attempted to escalate further. He tried to publicly challenge her decisions, but she was prepared. She presented facts, evidence, and a clear plan, leaving no room for manipulation. The meeting ended with the higher-level managers noting her competence and composure. Though no immediate action was taken against her boss, the power dynamic had begun to shift. Her patience, preparation, and quiet assertiveness were gaining recognition. She also began mentoring a few trusted colleagues, sharing insights on navigating office challenges with integrity and patience. She emphasized observation, careful planning, and calm action. Her guidance helped others handle difficulties without losing composure, creating a small circle of competence and support within the organization. She realized that her influence was growing, not just through her actions, but through the empowerment of others. One night, after a long day of work and community engagement, she sat quietly in her apartment, reviewing her journal and planning next steps. She reflected on how far she had come, from the early days of subtle attacks and intimidation to her growing recognition and influence. She understood that the journey was not over, but she had learned valuable lessons: patience, careful observation, strategic action, and the power of quiet strength. By the end of this part of her journey, she had transformed from a silent observer into a deliberate, strategic force. She was no longer merely defending herself. She was shaping her environment, quietly influencing outcomes and preparing for larger challenges. Her silence had become a tool of power, her patience a weapon, and her careful actions a shield. The storm that had begun around her was now being met with calm, calculated responses that would set the stage for the next phase of her journey. The third part of her story closed with a sense of readiness. She had endured pressure, observed the weaknesses of her antagonist, built a network of support, and strengthened her own resolve. She was no longer just surviving the attempts to crush her. She was actively preparing to rise above them. The world was beginning to take notice of her quiet strength, and when the time came, she would act in ways that could no longer be ignored. Her storm was forming, and she was ready to unleash it thoughtfully and powerfully. The storm had begun, though no one in the office fully realized it yet. She moved with careful precision, using the quiet strength she had cultivated over months to navigate the challenges around her. Each day she observed the actions of her boss and colleagues, noting inconsistencies, weaknesses, and opportunities. She no longer feared confrontation because she understood that preparation, patience, and truth were her allies. Her influence began to grow subtly but unmistakably. Colleagues who had once doubted her now sought her advice on complex projects. They recognized her calm authority and ability to handle pressure with grace. She shared guidance quietly, helping them navigate difficult situations while avoiding unnecessary conflict. Slowly, a network of respect and trust formed around her, strengthening her position in ways her boss could not easily undermine. The antagonist grew restless. He tried increasingly aggressive tactics, but each attempt revealed his own flaws. He made decisions without full consideration, misjudged colleagues' reactions, and spread rumors that fell flat because she had anticipated them and prepared counter-evidence. Every time he acted, she quietly documented it, understanding that this information could serve her when the moment came to confront the larger system of injustice he represented. One day, a serious issue arose in a department critical to the company's success. A project was failing, and blame was being shifted carelessly. Instead of panicking or allowing herself to be swept aside, she stepped forward with a clear, practical solution. She coordinated with the team, outlined corrective steps, and ensured that tasks were properly delegated and tracked. Her actions stabilized the situation and prevented what could have been a major loss. Colleagues began to see her not just as capable, but as someone who could lead even in the toughest circumstances. Her boss tried to diminish her role, but she responded with calm, factual explanations and thorough documentation. Higher-level managers began to notice. They saw the results of her work and the quiet competence she brought to the office. Slowly, she started to earn recognition, even if it was not yet public. Her storm was taking shape, and it was fueled by action, evidence, and integrity rather than anger or confrontation. Outside of work, she continued her community engagement. The children she helped at the center began to speak more confidently, inspired by her example. Families noticed her patience and dedication. These moments reminded her that her life had meaning beyond professional challenges. The respect and trust she cultivated in her community reinforced her courage, reminding her that her influence could extend beyond the office and reach people who would carry lessons of resilience and integrity forward. Her evenings were spent in reflection and planning. She reviewed notes, documented events, and considered how best to address ongoing challenges. She also allowed herself moments of rest, understanding that endurance required balance. Long walks, quiet meals, reading, and meditation were her ways of sustaining energy and clarity. She was learning that strength was not just in action, but in knowing when to pause, reflect, and recharge. Her strategic actions began to have a ripple effect. Projects improved under her guidance, and colleagues started to take more initiative themselves, inspired by her example. Her calm problem-solving contrasted sharply with her boss's reactive and often aggressive behavior. It became increasingly clear to those around them that she was the steady force, capable of delivering results without drama or fear. Her reputation quietly expanded, even as she maintained her humility and silence. One afternoon, a higher-level manager approached her privately. They had been observing her work and the challenges she had faced, and they wanted to understand her perspective. She shared insights calmly, pointing out not only problems but also practical solutions. The manager listened intently, impressed by her clarity, professionalism, and the evidence she provided. This meeting marked a turning point. She realized that recognition was coming, not through confrontation, but through consistent action, integrity, and careful preparation. Her boss grew increasingly frustrated. He attempted to manipulate situations, question her competence publicly, and spread doubts among colleagues. But she was ready. Her documentation, preparation, and network of quiet allies ensured that his tactics were ineffective. Each failed attempt only highlighted his flaws. The more he tried to control the narrative, the more his desperation became visible to others. She began mentoring a small group of trusted colleagues, sharing techniques for navigating challenges with integrity and calm. She emphasized observation, careful planning, and strategic action. These sessions strengthened her circle of influence and reinforced the idea that success was not about domination, but about competence, patience, and quiet leadership. Her impact on others became increasingly evident as they adopted her approach and began to succeed in their own roles. One evening, she received an anonymous note praising her recent project work. It was brief, simple, and encouraging, but it reminded her that her quiet strength was being noticed even by those who preferred to remain unseen. This small acknowledgement reinforced her belief in the power of persistence, patience, and thoughtful action. She understood that recognition and respect often came quietly, through observation and results rather than loud self-promotion. Her home became a place of reflection and restoration. She spent time reading books that inspired courage and strategy, preparing meals that nourished both body and mind, and walking through quiet streets where she could observe life without the pressures of the office. These routines were essential, grounding her and allowing her to face each day with renewed clarity and strength. She understood that personal well-being was a key component of resilience. As the storm in the office intensified, she maintained her focus. She continued to document every incident, every attempt to undermine her, and every instance where her contributions had been overlooked. She knew that this record would be invaluable when the time came to address the broader patterns of injustice. Her approach was deliberate and patient, understanding that change often required careful strategy rather than immediate confrontation. She also began to take more visible leadership in projects, not seeking credit, but ensuring that important tasks were completed efficiently and effectively. Her calm authority and problem-solving skills drew attention from colleagues and higher-level managers alike. Her boss attempted to challenge her, but his actions only revealed his insecurity and lack of preparedness. Each confrontation, handled with composure and clarity, shifted the perception of power in the office. Her community work remained a source of strength and inspiration. She continued to guide children and families, sharing lessons of resilience, patience, and self-respect through her actions. She saw the impact of her influence growing, both in the office and in her community. These connections reminded her that her life had meaning beyond professional challenges, and that the positive effects of her courage and integrity extended far beyond herself. One day, a colleague confided in her about unfair treatment they had faced from the same boss. She listened carefully, offered advice, and shared strategies for documenting and addressing the issue. Her guidance was thoughtful and practical, and the colleague left feeling empowered. She realized that her influence was not only about her own resilience, but about helping others navigate challenges with integrity and strength. By the end of this part of her journey, she had transformed the environment around her. The storm that had once threatened to crush her was now being met with calm, deliberate, and strategic action. She had built a network of allies, earned respect through consistent competence, and maintained her integrity despite ongoing challenges. Her quiet strength was becoming a force that could no longer be ignored, setting the stage for the culmination of her journey. The fourth part of her story closed with the realization that she had not only survived the storm, but had begun to shape it. Her patience, careful planning, and quiet leadership had created momentum that could lead to meaningful change. The antagonist's power was diminishing, not through confrontation alone, but through the consistent, deliberate, and principled actions of a woman who refused to be broken. The world was beginning to take notice, and when the time came, she would rise fully, unstoppable and undeniable.